welcome to the Undiplomatic Podcast. I am Julia Gledhill. Y'all are stuck with just me today as Matt and Van are otherwise occupied. But I am thrilled to welcome Jasmine Owens to the podcast to discuss the difference between nuclear disarmament and nuclear abolition, why it matters, and what's going on in the nuclear field writ large. Jasmine has worked in the peace and security field for several years now, and I'm happy to call her a friend, although I can't quite remember how we met. We'll have to discuss that later. She graduated from the Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey with a degree in nonproliferation and terrorism studies. Jasmine was the associate director for the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program at Physicians for Social Responsibility and recently finished up a project with Win Without War, where she outlined her vision for the nuclear abolition movement going forward. So without further ado, Jasmine, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you? I'm excited and a little nervous to be here.
We're really excited to have you on the podcast. I think this conversation is timely. We're recording the week after the 79th anniversaries of the U.S. atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I wanted to have you on Undiplomatic because in your writing, you do such a great job of providing historical context to the arguments that you make against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. It's also really important to have higher level conversations about nuclear weapons that go beyond just questions of nuclear policy. With that said, I want to ground this conversation in a question that I hear really often in the nuclear weapon space. What do you say to folks who argue that nuclear weapons are needed to deter major conventional wars?
Yeah, I honestly, when I get this question, I'm just kind of like, but have they really deterred any major? Like, we've got Korea, we've got Vietnam, we've got Iraq, we've got Afghanistan, we've got Ukraine, we've got Palestine. Like, there are so many wars and major wars that have been happening since the dawn of the nuclear age in 1945. And like to that, I say, what have nuclear weapons done apart from, actually using the nuclear weapons, which even in some of these wars, like some US presidents were trying to use nuclear weapons, especially in Korea and in Vietnam. Like they were options on the table at one point or another. And the only reason that we didn't use them is because they are so absolutely atrocious that using them in battle, you're going to harm your own soldiers as well. They're useless. They're militarily useless. They're basically just political vehicles for these nuclear powers to carry out wars in other countries and be like, you can't come here because if you come here, we've got nuclear weapons and we're not afraid to use them. But we can go to your countries and we can mess all that up and we can destroy your economy and your livelihoods and force you to flee and have to become lifelong refugees under the guise of, being a global superpower and a kind of arbiter of democracy, which there's great conversations too about, with the existence of nuclear weapons, is there even such thing as an actual democracy? Because when you think about, especially with the US and having sole authority, with one person who has the finger on the button, who has the authority to launch these weapons to end all life on Earth, like that doesn't feel very democratic. That's definitely the opposite. So whenever I hear these questions of, these weapons are needed to keep us safe, to deter these major wars, I just am kind of like, I don't believe it because the evidence has proven otherwise, honestly.
Yeah, that's such a big question. Can there be democracy when, one man can press the nuclear button and threaten annihilation, really, of the globe? And I think you capture something that I've seen articulated elsewhere, but I think is a really interesting course of study, which is that like nuclear brinkmanship isn't just about rationality, right? Like so much of deterrence theory, which is a whole nother conversation. We're not going to get into that because, oh my God, there's so much to say. And you definitely know more about it than I do. But, it's not just about rationality. It's also about human psychology. It's about emotions. So you can talk about modernizing command and control systems. You can talk about establishing new hotlines between nuclear powers in the future. But like there will always be the threat of annihilation. And frankly, when you think about historical events, like, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's like we lucked out that their number one was that line of communication between, Kennedy and Khrushchev, and that cooler heads prevailed mostly on the part of Khrushchev, if I have my history right, because they pretty much decided not to escalate. And we can't count on that in the future. And I mean, this is something that, again, is the course of a lot of academic study, but it's like Thomas Schelling has said that the nuclear threat is a threat that leaves something to chance. And I think that that itself is a major understatement when you're thinking about the psychology of humans in the presidency.
Yeah. And when you take that into account and just like the unpredictability of human nature too, like that, there is nothing that you cannot fully predict how someone's going to react in any scenario. You can plan all you want, but you can never fully predict how that's going to go. But then on the other hand too, is like, so many people aren't aware that we came so close to not just initiating like a world nuclear war, but like also just bombing our own citizens in the US. And like due to luck and chance and like one faulty switch, we didn't. And so when like knowing that, I'm just like, I don't understand how you can even defend keeping these weapons that are so dangerous and clearly are so unpredictable as well. And then you get that in with like the human unpredictability. I'm like, this is just a recipe for disaster. And the only thing that has kept us like off, away from a nuclear catastrophe is truly luck. And then in some cases too, like one person deciding to defy orders and like, I'm not going to press this button to launch nukes because like I don't know if this is a real threat and I'm not willing to do that.
Right.
So it's just all of it is just so it's left up to so much chance and luck and relying on just like we really hope this person does the right thing in the moment. And it's
Right.
like that is not a sound strategy. Like
No.
it's not rational.
Yeah, one might say it is in fact irrational. And to your point
Yeah.
about depending on the principled behavior of an underling, like isn't that what Schlesinger did with Nixon when he was sort of losing his head a little bit at the end of his presidency? Literally said, I'm not going to move forward with this unless it's co-signed by Kissinger, I think was his rationale. And that's not an authority he was vested with anywhere, from what I understand. So it's like, yeah, it's a really scary prospect. And obviously I've been thinking about this in the context of like Ukraine, like, oh, like, would Russia have invaded Ukraine if they didn't give up their nuclear weapons? And that's like, again, another conversation, but like writ large, higher level, it is irrational and arguably not very strategic for us to be kind of at the whim of an individual who really could bring us to the threat of nuclear war and bring us to nuclear brinkmanship. So now that I guess we've thrown the nuclear policy wonks a bit of a bone, I'd like to kind of dig into the some of the topics that you cover in your recent writing for Bulletin for Atomic Scientists, as well as for Win Without War. You have written about the difference between nuclear disarmament and nuclear abolition. Can you tease out for us what those distinctions are and why they're important?
Yeah, and like also this is so important for policy wonks as well. Like policy and movement building are inextricably linked, and I think that is so clearly defined within the like anti-nuclear movement in general. I kind of use that as an umbrella that includes those who advocate for arms control, those who advocate for disarmament, and those who advocate for abolition. And so I'll get into those differentiations and then talk about like those intersections as well. But I kind of came to wanting to make these distinctions in like recently in the past like couple years as I was really engaging on the organizing and movement building side of the anti-nuclear or I guess field. I I was feeling a lot of frustration because I felt like there were not clear definitions of like what we were working towards, which then like really impacted like how I could work, how people viewed my work, and also I saw it was people then like weaponizing, especially like social justice language or language that is used in a lot of these other movements and kind of intellectual spaces to think about abolition, oppression, intersectionality, using this language and saying we're doing this to seem like they were being progressive and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot, but not actually doing it. And so I was just really like, we need to clearly define like what we're doing. And the definitions don't make it so that like any particular group is better than the other. Because I think they're all needed to kind of help us actually like get rid of the threat of nuclear weapons and ultimately get rid of these weapons. Um, and I know like there's a lot, I have my feelings sometimes too about arms control and incrementalism and what have you. But ultimately, I think that like progress is progress. But the difference for me, I felt as I was also like doing a lot of readings from, you know, indigenous movements for sovereignty and land back, um, learning more about the Black radical tradition and the Black freedom movement and really how they were organizing and how they kind of thought about the world, uh, I felt like there needed to be these distinctions and that disarmament and abolition are very different because often in the nuclear space, they're lumped together. Disarmament, disarmers and abolitionists are often considered one and the same. And to me, they're very different because there are people who are nuclear disarmers. And so with the nuclear disarmament, that's very much seeking to eliminate, you know, all types of nuclear weapons, establishing monitoring and verification safeguards to make sure that no one's trying to secretly like rebuild a nuclear program or build one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it's very much, it kind of stops there. It stops at eliminating these weapons, ensuring that we can't rebuild them, that we don't have to encounter this threat again, you know, having those verification and monitoring methods, building the trust and the transparency and confidence building measures as well to help us, you know, create these systems. Um, and so that's one goal. And that's not like that's a very audacious goal, as we all know. Like as you know, especially, you know, all the work that you do with the military industrial complex and weapons manufacturers and these defense contractors and how much they're just like siphoning all of our taxpayer dollars for
Yep.
profits. All of that is very much like that makes it so difficult to make progress on even just arms control. Like even just trying to like I remember when I first started at PSR and at the time, the sea launched nuclear cruise missile was
Mm-hmm.
like the big thing. We're trying to get Slickum. We're trying to prevent this from happening. We don't need this. And like even that was such a slog. And it shouldn't be. Like it's just a random weapons system or, you know, a class of weapon that we don't really need. But
And Biden has said so, right? Like even Biden's been like, we don't really need this, guys.
yeah, and defense contractors are like, "No, but we actually do." And Congress is like, "Okay," you know, there's without question. So anyways, like, all that to say, nuclear disarmament and even at this point, arms control are not easy things to achieve,
Mm-hmm.
given how much of a chokehold that the military industrial complex has on our government and a lot of these nuclear powers. But then with nuclear abolitionists, um, this is very much, I think, to me, rooted in the Black radical tradition, in the movement to abolish slavery, and now its modern form, the movement to abolish prisons and police. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's very much seeking to address the root problems of the issue. So, in this case, nuclear weapons. What systems are undergirding these weapons and forcing us to think that we need them to exist and forcing them to be so kind of woven into our society at this point that it's incomprehensible for so many people to imagine a world without them, which is mind-boggling to me. So yeah, so and abolitionists very much come at this from an intersectional lens. So how do the issue of nuclear weapons and the threats that they pose intersect with white supremacy, with capitalism, with patriarchy, with all of these other systems of oppression? Because they do, especially when you think about the victims of nuclear weapons and not just when they're detonated in war, but every step of the way that these weapons are, you know, mined, produced, developed, tested,
Right.
etc. It causes harm, and that's often on indigenous and Black communities, poor communities. The most vulnerable to radiation exposure are women and children and the elderly, especially young girls, like infants and young girls are the most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's understanding that this problem is not a singular issue. It is tied up in all of these other systems of oppression and working with these other movements to seek justice, to break down these systems of oppression, to build a new world that is actually just and um, equitable and sustainable. But yeah, I'll stop there. I could go on and on, as you can tell. But there
Yeah.
is a difference. But all that to say is, like, it doesn't mean that one is necessarily better than the other. I think that, in my view, I think abolition will be the most successful in us building people power and movement building that will then get us to enact policies to get there. Uh,
Mhm.
but that doesn't discredit, like, the work that anyone else is doing, whether it's on disarmament or arms control.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. There are a couple threads I want to pull on. And one of my questions was sort of how do you balance the need for policy change with the need for sustainable intersectional movement building? This is something I think about a lot in the Pentagon budget space, as you can imagine. I never thought that I would be pursuing a niche in weapon acquisition, but yet here I am. And part of the reason for that is because, like as you say, progress is progress, and I would like to see changes in my lifetime. But I think to your point, in thinking about nuclear weapons, we've been pretty damn lucky that we haven't experienced nuclear war, that the United States has, well, been the only country to, detonate these weapons in a war scenario. Deterrence theories, whatever school of thought you subscribe to, it's psychology, it's human emotion. We don't have a lot of data. What we do have data on are the impacts of nuclear testing, the impacts of, plutonium pit production, like the ways that these weapons impact our communities. And so I think you've kind of addressed this question of, how do you balance that need for policy change and movement building in terms of bringing in those communities and making them a big part of the conversation about nuclear weapons, which is not really the case in the nuclear field from my perspective. And so it's good to hear that these different approaches to non-proliferation kind of buttress each other. But I guess on kind of a tangible level, maybe abolitionists think more long term about a mindset shift in the way that society conceives of nuclear weapons, while disarmers are a lot more focused on arms control in the here and now, which both are valuable. How does that impact their policy success today? I mean, obviously, you've written a report on building the world anew and like the future of the nuclear abolition movement, and I want to get there. I'm curious if you see, if nuclear abolitionists and disarmers are both looking to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons now. What does that mean for their potential for policy success today?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a concern. Ultimately, like, whether you're an abolitionist, a disarmer, an arms controller, like, no one wants to see more nuclear weapons, unless you are a defense contractor and you're like, yeah, build them. But no one wants to see that. And so, every action that we do as well is trying to prevent more nuclear weapons being built, being modernized in the case of the US. Because that is, to me, also kind of, you're basically kind of building new nuclear weapons, whether they like to believe it or not.
Yes,
But
yes. This is a thing
no,
that industry does. Oh, we're just going to make this small, tiny change. It turns into an entirely new program of record.
literally, yeah. And it's like now, and like they're trying to build all these new plutonium pits, and it's so out of control in terms of timeline and cost, and like it's just not feasible. But anyways, I think that is definitely a part of all of the work that any anti-nuclear weapons person is doing, is very much like, we can't have one more weapon in this world. Um, and I mean, a lot of that is related to policies, obviously, because no one can build these weapons but governments. They're very expensive to make. They
Hmm.
used to be very difficult to make, and there is a lot of knowledge that's involved with it. But I think now that knowledge is probably a bit more widespread, but still very expensive. And um, a lot of the work, like, I wanted to touch on the policy question because I feel like within the nuclear space, so much of the work feels like we're putting the cart before the horse, because so much of the focus is on policy, uh,
Hmm.
which, like, it's important, absolutely, like, we need to create policies that are going to make this change, but we don't have the political power to actually enact those policies. Like, the reason that we can't enact them is because we don't have the political power to make these politicians and these leaders feel like, if I don't do this, like, my whether it's my position or my reputation or whatever they care about, if that's not threatened, they're not going to do it. Because we don't have the funding to like lobby and, match the funding that the military industrial complex has. They have billions of dollars to spend to lobby these members of Congress to create a whole ICBM coalition that's just like determined to keep these missiles in the ground no matter what. It's just so stupid and so useless. But we don't have that money, and so we need to build people power, and there's not as much emphasis on that. And I think a lot of that is due to just the way that like funding is set up within the nonprofit space. It's very much so much of it is you have to then like at the end of your cycle, you have to be like, you have to prove that you achieved what you set out to achieve, essentially. And if you didn't, you have to really explain why that didn't happen.
Right.
And that like they're not going to cut off funding completely. And that's not tenable for movement building, because movement building it's not as easily quantifiable as, we got X policies passed or X numbers of members of Congress to support a policy or what have you. Movement building is a lot more, it has to be a lot deeper work, and it's very slow, because especially when working with impacted communities, indigenous communities, those who have been harmed by these systems of oppression, they're going to be very wary of wanting to work with outsiders, because they have been spurned in the past. They have been harmed by people who have been, who say they're coming in to help, but then have caused even further harm.
Right.
And there's a lot of trust building that has to go with that, and it takes time. And it's not something that you can really, put in a grant report very easily. And so
Yeah.
like just the way that funding is set up, it doesn't work for movement building. And so the little groups that do it, it's slow, it's in the background, it's not funded really. And the bigger groups that get funding, they're doing it on other issues, because that's what these foundations are willing to fund. So I think in order for us to actually make progress on enacting policies that are, not just for meat arms control, but are actually, trying to seek some form of like transformative justice for these impacted communities, and that are actually trying to get rid of these weapons, that work is just it's difficult. It's difficult to do. It's difficult to manifest. It takes a long time. And unless our systems are set up to support that, like it's going to take forever to do that. And it's going to take forever for us to pass any policies that we want, because we just simply don't have the political power, and we're not spending time or resources on building it.
Right. Yeah, I can certainly sympathize. I feel like I've been kind of adjacent to the nuclear field for a while. And I actually, I just came back a couple of weeks ago from a week in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with a program hosted from Dartmouth and Sandia Labs. And I spent a week at Sandia Labs learning all about nukes, learning from physicists, from strategists, like all about nuclear weapons. We learned how to calculate lethal radius, all that jazz. And frankly, I walked away with more questions than I did answers, which was definitely the point. It was not, it was an educational conference where, we kind of learned about the arguments for proliferation, for abolition, for disarmament, and we're able to, do the calculations on like survivability and hardness of targets and second strike. It was very intense for me, because it's just not been what I've worked on, being a Pentagon budget oversight person. But the reason I bring it up is because we did a arms control scenario where there was a blue country and a red country. The blue country is the status quo power, and the red country is, adversary of sorts. Anyway, the point is that, we're thinking about this arms control treaty and whether to renew or revise it at the 10-year expiration date, and every small group decided to increase their arsenals. And it was really a lesson in kind of strategic stability and like kind of the sticky questions that are tied up in the nuclear weapons world. If I could uninvent nuclear weapons, I would totally turn back the clock. But with that in mind, that was a bit of a tangent. Tell us about your vision for the nuclear abolition movement. You've written about emergent strategy and its potential to affect positive change in, bringing in impacted communities to questions about nuclear weapons. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that makes me so sad about everyone in that group saying to increase the arsenals, because I'm just like, what about building trust and transparency and
Yeah. It was tough. It was tough.
because and I think that leading into the question is like, I I mean, just again, from my perspective, just witnessing so many failures because, like, in the nuclear space, again, like, we're so underfunded and we don't have the people power. And so we're constantly like failure is a very good companion of ours, if you will. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I know, I think we'll touch on the failure aspect in a bit, but so I'll hold off on that. But I think my vision for the movement is very much like I really want to push for movement building and to really start to build this power so that we can become somewhat of a threat to these people in power and force them to actually do the right thing and not just like what these defense contractors want them to do and pay them to do. Um, and so much of that is wrapped up, I think, in integrating emergent strategy into the movement and really trying to get other folks to engage that way. And for those that don't know what emergent strategy is, it's a strategy that has been, I mean, honestly, it's funny because it has a lot of different, like, it's been used in many different ways. Like, there are back in, I think, like the 80s, there were talks about emergent strategy and reframing leadership, away from this like top, this hierarchical structure into something that's more decentralized and more adaptive. Uh,
Okay.
but then also, it is something that was very rooted in the writings of Octavia Butler and how she wrote her mainly female protagonists in her novels. It was very very like adaptational and leadership forward storytelling. Uh, and so much of how she was like, let's envision, what these new worlds can look like really leaning into the visionary aspect of building new worlds. Like science fiction is so important, I think, to movement building and to like
Whoa, I love that.
organizing because like you cannot, like as Lucille Clifton says, you cannot create what you cannot imagine. And it's like you're
Mm.
never going to be able to build a world without nuclear weapons if we cannot imagine it. And so when people say that, I'm just like, why is your imagination so limited? Open it up. But anyways, um, it has again, and it has roots in complex science or complexity science, which is very much like studying complex adaptive systems to better understand how they're structured and how they function and like how they're able to achieve results, as well
Okay.
as biomimicry and permaculture, and basically like learning and observing, learning from the environment and taking, aspects of the natural systems and models that exist within the environment and applying that to complex human problems. Um, and also deeply, deeply rooted in Black and Indigenous ways of knowing and being in right relationship with the world. Um,
Mm.
so much of like, as I was doing this research, so much of this kind of adaptive, decentralized, interdependent, nonlinear movement strategy is coming from Indigenous communities and Black communities. And there's a great, an I'm gonna pronounce it so wrong. There's a great Indigenous activist, Leanne Betsamosake Simpson, and in her book that she wrote with um, another Black or with a Black activist, she mentioned that imperialism and ongoing colonialism, like they have been happening for as long as like Indigenous and Black people have existed.
Hmm.
Like they have been creating apocalypses for these communities since they came about. Uh,
Yeah.
and so it's like these communities have survived several apocalypses. This is something that they're very used to. They know how to survive in these conditions. And
Hmm.
so, like, learning from how they're able to be resilient, to be sustainable, to be adaptive is so crucial to like building an adaptive and sustainable movement. And so, all that to say, emergent strategy is very much essentially just like a strategy for building complex patterns and systems of change through relatively small interactions. And so it really emphasizes too, like the small is a reflection of the all. And like these systems are made up of each of us. And
Mm-hmm.
we're not enacting and practicing that change and the worlds we're trying to build each day, like we're not going to create this change on a broader level because and two, like if we're trying to build new systems, if we're not doing that internal reflection and addressing any, internalized oppression we may have, whether that's internalized racism, internalized misogyny, internalized capitalism, um, if we're not doing that work to kind of unlearn how oppression has very much like shaped the way we think, like we're just going to recreate these systems over and over. um,
Mm-hmm.
so much of like emergent strategy and abolition it's not just systemic transformation, but it's also self-transformation, which I really like, and which is also I have found a huge like obstacle for some folks, especially in the nuclear space, who have been around for decades and who have made this their entire career and who are very not open to new ideas or new voices. Um,
Yeah.
doing that reflection does not feel comfortable for them. And so then what happens is then, projecting that onto others and kind of disparaging this movement and this concept and this strategy. And so it is something that is very difficult for some, but I think is so necessary for us to get anywhere is if we're not like reflecting how we're perpetuating these systems of oppression, then we're just going to continue maintaining them and building them. Um, yeah.
Whoa, that was meta. I'm trying to figure out how to respond. But I really, really like the adage that small is all. And I think that that's really comforting as well, for, those of us in the foreign policy field, advocacy writ large, or just, fighting for change at the local and state level, to see governance that puts people first. It does start with conversations, and I think it can be at times discouraging to think that these types of conversations, imaginative conversations, have no impact. But in fact, if you find yourself in, working for Richard Nixon, like actually, yeah, you can just defy rules that don't exist, assume authority that no one granted you with, and have a huge impact on the world. uh, like you think about the people, who have made their way through the National Security Council or White House cabinet or whatever, and there probably are many instances of folks drawing red lines that we might not even know about. We see it in the context of Gaza and State Department officials quitting. You can work for incremental change, and you can also be really, really brave when it really, really counts.
Mhm.
And so I have to remind myself of that, being here in DC, that small is all, that imagination is good. And that, it's important, I think, to have dreamy conversations, if you will, because frankly, like when I write and think about the world in general, I try to imagine like my great great grandkids. I try to imagine the 2050s, the 2060s. And obviously, I'm kind of a budget person. So, in thinking about a lot of these questions, whether they're nuclear policy questions or otherwise, like I want to think about our ability to not just respond to the threats of the future, like climate change, but also in a more positive outlook, like how can we generate a world that will actually promote collective prosperity, or at least the potential for collective prosperity, for our great great grandkids and their kids, etc. And that's really
Yes.
important.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to touch on like the like dreamy conversations, the like imaginative and visionary conversations are like so crucial. I like I was just thinking about how I think it was like what was it back in it was either like the early 1900s or like the late 1800s where there was a book, a science fiction book that first talked about like splitting the atom. Like it happened like this idea.
Wait, really?
Yes,
That's
I'm
wild.
forgetting what the book is, but there was a book that, like, kind of, like I don't know how in depth it went, but, like, that was, like, I think one of the first times that, like, this was really, I guess, put on the main stage. I'm sure scientists and physicists were, like, talking about this in their circles back then, but, like, I don't know, I wasn't there. Um, but, like, that, like if you think about it in the reverse, like there are people who are imagining these really awful things in science fiction that then are actually like being, materialized in real life. And so like so much of our how we shape our world is inspired, I think, through art and through these avenues that people view as like less worthy or less important than, which I think all of this is so steeped in patriarchy.
Yes.
The idea of that, like anything that deals with like the imagination or emotions or anything like
Oh, that is not important. Also, just like, sorry to interrupt you back, but like the idea that, we can't have these conversations and be taken seriously is really steeped in patriarchy and misogyny, in part because also having these conversations um, is an effort to change the nature of the conversation, of the field, of the community, of our societal outlook, right? And
yes.
that threatens individuals with power,
Yep.
and not just individuals with power, but individuals with power and influence and ability to capitalize, whether it be socially, professionally, or financially. And so I think about like this kind of goes back to the question about like not just industry interest in the proliferation of weapons, conventional or otherwise, the way that that manifests in rivalries between the military services and competing for budgets, high level military officials competing for lines on their resume. I started this big new fancy program. I fielded this new weapon. It cost $1 million bajillion. Nobody wants to say on the resume, oh, I actually canceled this because we spent a bunch of stupid money on it and we shouldn't be doing that. It's like it's all, so much of it is wrapped up in individual conceptions of success rather than concern for the collective, much less the future.
And I was going to say too, like that is also, I think, so steeped in patriarchy as well, because there is, I think, the article by Carol Cohn, Sex and Death in the World of Defense, Rational Defense Intellectuals, I think is
Yes.
called.
Yes.
Like where she gets into like observing how these, military officials would talk about nuclear weapons, and like everything is so phallic. Everything is just so centered on the penis and like
Yeah.
masculine. And it's just like, it's just such like nuclear weapons, I feel like are such an epitome of patriarchy. And I think that is also why they're so steeped into our culture. But to like that also is like why so much of the work that nuclear abolitionists and some disarmers are working on is trying to change like who's talking about these issues, because as you said, like for so long it's been just like these older white men, quite frankly, who are have the voices and are considered the authorities on nuclear issues. And sure, they're the authorities on creating these policies that are harming U.S. citizens and people around the world. But like, why are these impacted communities not the authorities on how these weapons cause real and tangible harm every day? And like, why is that not being elevated to the same level as like, oh, these weapons provide national security? And it's like, security for who? Because you
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
citizens right now who are being harmed, who are dealing with not just cancer from their exposure to radiation through nuclear testing or mining, or cleanup during the Cold War, but who's now their nieces and nephews and grandchildren and children are also all now dealing with these health issues.
Yep.
And none of this is ever talked about. We don't talk about the US government, doing secret experiments where they were injecting, Americans with plutonium without their knowledge or consent. Like, yeah, we don't
I
talk
did not know that.
human radiation experiments. The Plutonium Files is like the book by Eileen Wellerson. No,
Okay.
yeah, I'm getting all the names mixed up.
It's totally fine. People can Google. If
Yeah,
you're interested,
Plutonium
Google
Files.
it. Or I'll put it in the show notes or something.
Yeah, I can send you all the links. But like, there are so many ways that like we have caused harm to our own citizens, much like to not even talk about, citizens that we're harming in other countries, because
Yeah.
we do that too. We've done all of that in this pursuit of security and power. And it's like, but who, in reality, security and power for who? Because it's not for us. It's for the people making the weapons, the people who are in these positions of power who benefit from, again, the money that's coming in from these people making these weapons. And so when we have impacted communities members coming in and like talking to members of Congress and sharing their stories, like I have seen in real time, these members of Congress changing their minds on their support for these weapons, and supporting, in this case, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which was a program that provided partial compensation to a small portion of U.S. citizens exposed to radiation. But when we change the story, when we have these conversations that are maybe considered, not as I guess, like, rational, or without emotion, um when we have these conversations, we actually make progress. We got really far with RECA, and we got Josh Hawley, of all people, became such a huge champion of RECA last year,
Hmm.
because there are a lot of impacted communities within Missouri. And once you get this on their radar, and they realize that their constituents are now holding their feet to the fire, they'll do something about it.
Right.
So changing, the messenger, changing the narrative is so important to this work as well. And which is why it's so important to have different perspectives, to, have different ways of thinking about this and approaching this work, and not just doing it the same thing over and over, which is why having these imaginative conversations, and these visionary conversations, and these conversations that are tougher and a lot more maybe emotional, or just harder to have, but are so necessary for us to actually get anywhere.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I have a lot more reading to do, I think, about kind of the theoretical foundations of emergent strategy, and this idea that, progress isn't linear in terms of movement building. And also from what I understand, it's emergent strategy kind of describes this idea that, we exist as a collective, we're connected. Like you talked about permaculture and indigenous, practices like agriculture. It's so interesting to think about that, not just the physical impacts of nuclear weapons, but the kind of insular nature of the nuclear field, and how it kind of festers because it is so isolated. And that really makes it, I think, I don't know how to put this. Resistant to change, whereas in permaculture, yeah, it's a closed loop system, but there are so many factors, and it feels like the nuclear field is um, uh, lacking the kind of diversity of opinion that would really foster more imaginative thinking, but also really test some of the assumptions and strategies that I think nuclear policymakers have made up until this point, if that makes sense. I want to kind of bring this back to the idea of, I mean, we kind of alluded to this conversation about strategic stability, which is not something that this episode is necessarily about. But I think the idea of emergent strategies as a method to movement build is interesting to talk about in the context of strategic stability, insofar as it has the potential to manifest on an international level and generate grassroots power. So, obviously there are sticky policy questions about nuclear weapon states, to the extent that they proliferate. How do you trust build? How do you prevent other countries from getting nuclear weapons? What role do you think that emergent strategies have in that conversation? Do you think that there are opportunities for international solidarity against the proliferation of weapons, even in countries for example, Russia, for example? Obviously, there was a lot of collaboration after the Cold War between the United States and the Soviets. And so I'm just interested, what does that look like, especially in an increasingly multipolar world? Are there examples of it thus far? That was a big question.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think emergent strategies is so useful for that. And I think it's necessary because we're never going to be able to build one singular global mass movement for anything.
No,
That's
no.
not feasible. How are we going to organize over 8 billion people into
Yeah.
one? No.
Yeah.
And so that's never realistic. But emergent strategies doesn't focus on that, because it very much centers decentralization and interdependence, and understanding that there is no hierarchical structure, that everyone has a role to play, and we all have a role to play in this system to help it move along, or to achieve our goal, whatever it is we're trying to do. And I think that is so crucial to building an intersectional movement and an international movement. And it's already kind of happening. So with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. That is like, I mean, even though there is technically like the ICAN headquarters,
Mm-hmm.
it is a very decentralized movement. It is a campaign of individuals, of organizations. There are like, UN delegates who are involved. Like there are so many people doing different things, and coming at it from different angles, but who are all working together to abolish nuclear weapons. And like their biggest success was creating the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, the ban treaty. And they won a Nobel Peace Prize for it because they were recognized as doing a very, very difficult, some would even say impossible feat by creating this treaty that explicitly says nuclear weapons are illegal. And like, obviously, yes, none of the nuclear weapon states have signed it yet. Like,
Yeah.
we knew that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
That would have been unrealistic. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter or it's, not effective, because when it entered into force or when it was about to enter into force, I believe at the end of like 2021, the US was scrambling to get countries to like not support, to pull out. Like they did not want this treaty to become a thing. Like I remember it leaking that the Trump administration was like sending letters to some countries to be like, don't.
Please no.
And like literally, and it's like, and that shows that like this is still a threat. Like they're not going to openly admit that. They disparage it all the time, but like it is a threat to them and their power. And they like to say that, it kind of seeks to undermine the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is considered the cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime, but that's not true at all. It very much like bolsters it. And it also it forces the nuclear powers to actually commit to Article 6 of the NPT, which is their commitments to disarm. Like they keep saying, we have to create the environment, we have to create the environment. And it's like, okay, but you're not actually trying to create that environment. And like you have people who are, and now you're saying they're doing it wrong. And so all that to say, like I think is a great example of how like we can build a decentralized international movement. It is happening. And it doesn't all have to exist under ICANN, because again, I think you can look at ways that immersion strategies are being successful by looking at other movements. Like again, I learned all of this from Indigenous and Black activists who are doing the work, who have been doing the work, especially like complex movements in Detroit. And Adrienne Marie Brown, her book Immersion Strategies, really gives a good example of like how this movement was born, how this concept was born, and folks who have been who really like fleshed it out into a very comprehensive and like just full concept beyond what it was kind of the different aspects of complexity science and biomimicry and what have you it was pulling from. So all that to say, I think it's so crucial, and as well because it centers so much of like Indigenous and Black ways of like knowing and being, and so much focus on the environment and sustainability. I think it's so crucial, like as we are, in the midst of the climate crisis, and that it's only going to get worse. Like,
yep.
We can't continue to rely on policies and systems that force us to continue to extract from the environment without giving anything back. And like I see things in even the nuclear space where it's all like, we're going to have all these new technologies that are going to make our lives so much easier and make us live so much longer. Like, okay, and what slave labor are you going to use for that? All of the natural, materials that you're going to need to build this technology. Like that, it's just, that is so not sustainable. And so there's so much emphasis on creating new things and building new technologies that are bigger and better.
Yep.
And like not understanding that we kind of have everything we need to know already if we actually just like take a moment and like observe the environment around us and learn from these communities that are, in right relationship with the environment and have been, resilient and adaptive and sustainable for millennia, and who have survived worse conditions than we're in now. Like, I think in order for us to move forward and to kind of save ourselves in the world, we do have to look back in that way. And so many people are like, but that's not future forward. And I'm like, it is, because if you want to have a future.
I know. Again, this is putting like the 2060 lens on our policy conversations, on our conversations about the future in general. What does nuclear deterrence do for the climate threat?
Yeah. These weapons are
Yeah.
so bad for the environment. They also, if they're used, like, they will really fuck it up. Like, nuclear winter, that could actually be a thing with the, like, it would take just 3% of the world's nuclear weapons to cause a global famine that would kill around like 2.5 billion people.
Oh
And
God.
any more weapons than that, we're seeing upwards of 5 billion people being killed. And that's because of like when these weapons will go off, they'll create a lot of soot and stuff that will then go up into the atmosphere
Yeah.
and block the sunlight. We can't grow crops, we can't grow food. And then there's a global famine. And of course, that's
Mm-hmm.
going to hit the poor countries, the Black and brown countries the most. And it's going to be the Western countries and those with the money who think they won't feel it the most. But then also in the data, North America, Europe, and Russia are actually the most vulnerable in this scenario as well. So it's like this doesn't benefit anyone.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's very real. And actually, I thought that this would be a more depressing conversation than it has been, because it's, heartening and important to remember that the people most impacted by these weapons, by militarism writ large, have survived and have gone through, honestly, a lot worse. And so I have two final questions for you in our last few minutes here. You wrote this big report again for Win Without War about the future of the nuclear abolition movement, about the importance of emergent strategy in advancing that movement. And you said that as we've discussed, it requires a decentralized, adaptive, and resilient movement for nuclear abolition to be successful in affecting policy change on the national and international levels, explaining that that movement requires abolitionists to redefine what it means to fail as an individual and as a movement. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, this is such a huge thing for me personally too, because as a perfectionist at times, like failure sounds like the worst thing in the world.
Yeah.
And emergent strategies really forces us to redefine our relationship with failure. And I really love that, their concept of failure is like, it's never a failure. It's always a lesson. Like anything you do, you learn from it. You figure out, okay, what worked, what didn't work, and you get rid of what didn't work and you take forward what worked with you as you try again. And I think that is such a huge, I think that's so important to redefine failure in that way, because especially like taking it back to the funding aspect, when we think of like, what does it mean to fail at what you achieved? And it's like that, it shouldn't be so black and white, and it's not black and white. And if we redefine like what failure is to us, if we like understand that everything we're doing is just providing data for us to redefine or refine what we're doing and do better next time, then I think it really helps like get over these mental and also like material blocks that arrive, like, because I feel like when we think about failure, like there is the fear of doing new things, of trying these new strategies, trying these new actions, because there's a fear of like, is this going to work? And like, did we invest all this time and energy for it to fail? And it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
no, because no matter what you do, you're going to learn something from this, and you're going to be able to take something away from this. And I think that's just so important at like, especially in movement building and like, and in abolition, because abolition is very much about like building the world or practicing the world you want to build every day. And so it's like, if I'm in the prison and police abolition movements, it's very much of like, how can we decenter the carceral system and the police in our efforts to resolve community or interpersonal disputes. How do we look beyond these carceral systems? And any effort you're going to do, it's not going to succeed every time. It's
Yeah.
not always going to work. And like, and again, that's okay. It's just like, you learn from it and you try again. And so I think it's just having that mindset is so crucial for movement building, because it can be so just like dejecting at times and overwhelming and like depressing, especially when dealing with like such heavy topics.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important to remember that like everything you're doing is bringing you closer to your goal. So long as like you're doing that reflection, you're learning, you're taking with you what works and releasing what doesn't, which I think is also a huge thing for people to do. It can be very difficult to release as well. But yeah, I think it's so important. I think it really helps. I think it also really helps paint the issue and the movement and what you're trying to do in a more positive light as well. Because it's like, you don't have to worry about failing because that's not a thing. Everything you're doing, you're just gathering more data.
That's right.
Yeah, I think it's just a really good mindset shift that helps to just like clear those blockages and help really, I don't know, just kind of really get you present and involved in what you're doing.
Yeah. And engage with others. I feel like even when, in my experience in, the policy world in DC, especially coming from congressional advocacy. Yeah. I spent like 2 years trying to lobby Congress to repeal the law that enabled the Iraq war. And the House has repealed it 4 times and the Senate once, which was a big win, but still not done yet. No, it's like very disheartening, but you build community with one another, which I think is kind of speaking to the value of emergent strategy and dedicating oneself with alongside your peers to this like Sisyphean task of pushing a boulder up the hill even when it continues to fall. And this is like kind of a random example, but you were talking about like incarceration and taking failures as lessons in moving forward in your movement. And I read something in The Nation recently about how everybody's freaking out about drug legalization in Oregon and how it's actually been kind of affirmative to the folks that did push for legalization, because they're saying, if you just make all of these drugs legal without providing support systems, it's not going to go well. People are scared and their only response is, oh, we need more police on the streets. And it's like, okay, well, that's the one tool we've always used. But none of these people who are pushing for, the legalization were saying that we need to just get rid of police and do nothing else. It was get rid of police and establish support systems. And like that applies in thinking about some of these other issues. Like you can't just get rid of what exists without doing anything else. And so that's like that sort of like positive alternative making, and positive vision is a big part of the kind of imaginative conversations that we are referring to, I think. And to the point about kind of building community and finding joy and tapping into, resiliency and whatever it is that you advocate for. You spent several years in DC, the nuclear community here well. What advice do you have for young people who are interested in a career in the nuclear field and maybe scared to share big, dreamy ideas for concern for their career prospects?
I say do it. I think it, because like for me, I think it depends. If it can be more difficult if you are trying to do a traditional career and, work for the government, obviously.
Yeah.
You can't really be going around like abolish these weapons.
Yeah. Yes.
But if that's not your thing and you are just in general interested in this issue and wanting to learn more and speak more on it, like I think there is definitely more of an appetite for new ways of talking about this issue and new voices talking about this issue. And so I say do it. And it really helps to have community and to try and build community within the movement, within the nuclear field, but also outside. I think it's so good to have friends outside of the field as well, to like get you out of that and to ground you and be like, okay, there are other things in the world.
Talk to other people.
Get out of your bubble.
I'm saying that to myself, by the way.
I consider you my out of bubble friend because you're not nuclear focused. But I think it's so important to build community because this, like, dealing with nuclear weapons, especially if you are doing it from a more humanitarian environmental impacts perspective, it can be a lot. Like, I've seen some stuff and, having to hear all of these stories and to listen to these communities and like the just profound trauma that they've had to endure. It is a lot to take. And so I think building community is so key to that. Just like leaning on your friends, trying to not even just like network, because like not in that way.
That was a major eye roll for listeners.
I know, sorry.
No, I support it. I think networking is whack. Like, just talk to the people you're interested in and pursue relationships with them like a normal person.
And because and like there are things like Gin and Atomics in DC that I revived with my friend John Pope at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and now it's United Federation of Atomic Scientists has taken over for me because I left DC. like that is a whole like community building effort within the nuclear field, not just like nonprofit space. Like there's a lot of folks working in the government, working at think tanks who go to these events as well. And it's just about building community. And I think that's just so crucial in doing not just this work, but kind of any work, because it can be very isolating and lonely and overwhelming. And to just be able to have folks who you can lean on and kind of help you carry that burden is so crucial. And also like having those moments of joy and like fun are part of the work. Like you cannot be constantly like in the thick of it and not kind of taking yourself out and trying to do that care, because it's only going to cause burnout. And like, as a friend once said, like your burnout does not further the cause. It doesn't benefit anyone. So like, it's okay to like take a moment and like have fun and to like bring joy and like imagination and creativity into this work, because it's needed. It's so much involved in movement building and other spaces as well. So it's something that like I think the nuclear field could really benefit from. We could use a lot more fun.
Hang out with your friends.
I know.
Otherwise,
hang out with your friends.
I love that. Yeah, this has come up on the podcast before, but to summarize, I guess, for folks, small is all, have fun. I would add to Jasmine's advice, not that I am necessarily qualified to give nuclear policy dreamers advice in this realm, but theories are theories. They're not law. They're meant to be challenged. So, you know, that's what I try to remind myself as well, is that, you know, you got to bring in whatever your interests are, whether it's sci-fi, like there are other schools of academic theory that could inform nuclear conversations that maybe haven't been brought in, and you can do it.
Yes. And I was just going to add to, as we said, never failure, always a lesson. And as well, what you pay attention to grows is another huge lesson of immersion strategies. It's like, if we don't spend time on trying to imagine and build a new world, it's never going to happen. So we need to put our attention where we want to, you know, what the change that we want to see. And that's the only way we're really going to be able to do it. So if we're not doing the work, it's never going to happen. So we can't leave it to anyone else. We have to do it.
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot, but we all know. But if we all work on it together, we all only have to do a little piece, because we're all just one piece of the puzzle.
That's right. I love that. A burden shared is a burden halved, or, you know.
Yeah, whatever that is.
Whatever.
A rising tide lifts all boats.
I don't know. All right, now that we're done with every kitschy adage in the book, thank you for listening to this episode of the Undiplomatic Podcast. Thank you for coming on, Jasmine. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
All right, bye, y'all.